Thanks, Charles, and thank you everyone for coming. It's quite an honour and privilege to be able to talk about my story and the story of the men who I worked with in Nauru and who I now work with in Australia. It's also quite nice to I guess I'll be talking to you about health, even though I don't really have an expertise in health. But just through my experiences and my observations, I really want to outline what I saw in Nauru, in the Regional Detention Centre there, and also my current work now as a social worker in Sydney, working with asylum seekers who are living in the community on bridging visas. What's interesting about my story, and it's an introduction to the asylum seeker debate that wasn't uncommon to the people that I worked with in those initial early stages of the camp opening up in Nauru. And it's the idea that I didn't really have much experience or any experience with refugees or asylum seekers prior to going to Nauru. I originally got invested in the debate out of pretty much non-altruistic motives. There was a very pretty girl who was working at Oxfam with me. She told me that her mother took people to the little detention centre. And I said, yeah, I'm heaps interested in asylum seekers. Yeah, so passionate. And so I had this idea that I could choose the mother to meet the girl. And so with that idea, I went off to build a detention centre rather naively. And also to write this up for Oxfam. And it was in visiting Villa Detention Centre that I first heard the stories of asylum seekers. The first man had rope burns around his neck from an attempted suicide. He said that the Australian government had told him that they didn't think he was a real refugee. And so he deemed it a better option to attempt suicide than returning to Sri Lanka or facing death in detention in Australia. And within these stories, as tragic as they were, it was the situation that I found these people in that remained in detention centres in Australia without no knowledge of their future or any idea of what would happen to them and no autonomy over their own future. And it was that was most depressing about the detention centres and what really made me concerned for their plight, because some of them had been in that detention centre for years, and as far as I could tell, although I didn't know much about the politics of it all at that point, as far as I could tell, it was confusing for me as to why they were still there and why they weren't being given answers and why they weren't being processed. And so I started to get knowledgeable about the asylum seeker debate, and I learned about the Refugee Convention, and I learned about our two obligations to refugees, which is to hear their stories when they come to our shores, irrespective of the way they arrive, and if they need protection, then we protect them. And the other one is not to return people to countries or to situations where they'll be persecuted or oppressed again, and both of which we're failing at the moment. And so, even then, before going to Nauru, I was still very naive as to the situation I'd be getting myself into. I'd spent a few hours in Villawood and was exhausted by that experience. It was emotionally draining, just hearing people's stories and not really knowing how I could help them or not knowing what to say to them to make them feel better. And so after a few hours there, I was exhausted. So going over to Nauru should probably be a much more intimidating notion. The way it actually arose was that a friend of mine called me and said, the Salvation Army are hiring people to go to Nauru. And this was in the aftermath of the expert panel on asylum seekers. It was set up by Julia Gillard to address this idea of people drowning at sea. Or at least that's what she told the Australian public. And so they decided that we had to stop boats coming because it wasn't a humane way for people to come to Australia. And the idea of people risking their lives to come to Australia, we couldn't have that. So Julia Gillard and set up this expert panel, and they came to the conclusion, among other things, there was a lot of suggestions within the panel came up with that weren't addressed, but they came up with this idea of the no advantage policy, and the idea that we need to deter people from coming to our shores by boat by creating a situation that was so bad they wouldn't risk themselves. And so the idea of no advantage says it in the name, that we don't want to give these people an advantage over others. but we don't want these people to take advantage of our generosity. And so we had to punish them. And so you've already got a contradiction in terms here. Are we saving lives at sea and are we having a humane system? Or are we having a deterrence punishment system? A punitive system? And so my experiences of Nauru outweigh this notion of it being a humane policy. And so they re-established the Nauru Detention Centre and the Manus Island Detention Centre, and they started deporting asylum seekers from Christmas Island to Nauru in September 2012. And a friend of mine said, he gave me this number and said the Salvation Army are hiring people to work there, and the Salvation Army were going to be running these camps apparently. And so I called up this number, and just keep in mind she found this advertisement on Facebook. So I rang this number, and the woman said yes. And I didn't really know what to say because I've never applied for a job over the phone like this before. So I said, I'd like to go to Nauru. And the woman said, sure, when can you leave? And as amusing as that is, and it was magnificent, because it's the first job I've ever gotten without having a job interview. As amusing as that is, it shows already this the disregard the Salvation Army and the government have for the people they sent there, and the disregard for the refugees and asylum seekers who were supposed to be caring for. Because among this first group of Salvation Army workers, the humanitarian workers, the one who was supposed to be looking after these people, the only thing we had in common was the fact that none of us had experience with refugees. And so there was 18-year-old there was a woman who didn't know what an asylum seeker was. And the reason I'm giving you this holistic, I guess, overview of what Nauru was like is because it's all these little intricacies of the policy that make the health side of things so detrimental for asylum seekers. And having now been trained and worked as a caseworker for over a year now, and the amount of mental health training and suicide training we are given, not only to protect ourselves and give ourselves a good education knowing what our boundaries are, but also to be able to care for the people we're supposed to be working with. And now look back upon what I was given before going to Nauru, it's abysmal. So we weren't given any idea of what work we'd be doing in Nauru. We weren't given any cultural awareness training or be told, who these people were or why they were coming, or what the objective of going over there was. I still don't know, I haven't been told by the Salvation Army why they took the contract and what we were supposed to be doing over there. And so we went off, I guess, with a sense of adventure, but not as completely naive as that. I did know it was going to be something awful, but I didn't know just how bad it would be. And so we flew out to Nauru. Again, no knowledge of what to expect. And the only thing we did know is that the government had made us sign a contract. Also, the Salvation Army had made us sign a deed of confidentiality that stated we can't talk about anything that happens in the camp at all time to anyone. And that gives you an idea of what to expect, of the secrecy that surrounds this camp. The media were banned from entering the camp, and we were banned from talking to journalists, banned from posting any political comments on social media, and banned from emailing our loved ones. And we were threatened that ASIO would be checking our emails. There's 18-year-olds and university students for the majority. That ASIO would be checking our emails to see if we'd be passing on information to our mums and dads and girlfriends and boyfriends. And so, with that in mind, we arrived in Nauru, and it's a very small island, and it's 4 hours off the coast of Brisbane by plane. And the remoteness of this island can't be stressed enough. There's only 10,000 people on the island. It's extremely poor, and it relies on Australian aid to support it. There are no jobs, very small amount of infrastructure. There's dilapidated phosphate refineries, and there's a high obesity and high diabetes rating level. And so when you come in by plane, the plane actually envelops the island, and one of the asylum seekers said they thought they were landing on water. And around the outer edges of the island, it was paradise beaches. As you move closer and closer to the centre of the island, you pass the beautiful trees and I guess what you'd expect of a paradise Pacific Isle, and you move to the mined out phosphate rock, and it's just this almost wasteland of pinnacles of rock where the wind dies down and it becomes extremely hot, and that's where they house the asylum seekers in a very small fenced off detention centre. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind is that if you're taking these people, their stories from the very beginning, they're already coming from these countries of oppression and persecution, from war-torn countries of the aftermath of war. They're coming from places like Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, Burma. And I remember doing a school talk here actually where I asked the kids, what do you think of when you think of these countries? And they, all said war and bombs and terrorism. And so that's the places people are fleeing from. And a lot of the time they're taking planes across to Malaysia, Indonesia. They're managing to escape from their countries, pooling a lot of money together to get out. They get on a boat from Indonesia. Sometimes it can take 3 or 4 attempts to get a boat that actually gets to Australia. And they finally make it to Christmas Island and they're picked up by the Australian police. And one of the men described it to me as, my world was darkness and Australia was this pinprick of hope. And every time I asked them, why did you come, they always said, freedom, for human rights, so I can believe whatever I want to believe, without risk of persecution. And when they finally get here, they have this perception that there'll be a logical system, that they'll have their stories told. If the government deem they're in need of protection, they'll be protected. And what actually happens is they're taken from Christmas Island, they're deported to a foreign country in the middle of nowhere, where there's no infrastructure, a tiny island, and they're placed within that very small island, placed in a detention centre in the middle of the island. And the first people they have to talk to are me, the 18-year-old, and the person who doesn't know what an asylum seeker is. And they say, how long will we be here for? What's going to happen to us? When will we be sent to Australia? And the only questions we get, the only answers we can give them were, I don't know. And at that point I realised the reality of my job there. And I think they realised the reality of the position they were in, because that's when we first started to see people cry. And they were housed in dark green army tents and slept on stretcher beds. And I mean, I can talk about the physical harshness of the place, the gravel rock, the heat. When it rained, the camp would flood them up to their knees at some points. But that's almost irrespective, or irrelevant, sorry, because buildings were built over time, and the physical conditions did improve. The heat wore off at certain points of the year. But what makes this place so hard, and what makes detention in these centres detrimental to people's mental health, is the fact of this concept of indefinite detention, and the lack of certainty of the future, and the lack of autonomy over one's life. And so, if you give a person a sentence in Australia, if someone's committed a crime and you say, okay, you've stolen that piece of bread, we're going to give you a year in jail. There's a punishment, an obvious crime, an obvious punishment, and then at the end of that, the person can be released. For these people, there's a number of things that make it hard. For one, they don't see what their crime is. Because we have some convention, and we've told the world that we will take refugees if they need protection. And yet here they are being placed in what can only be called a prison. For two, this idea of not knowing when you can leave means you can't tell your families when you can leave. You can't plan ahead saying, oh, in 2 years' time I'll be back, or I can be sending money back to my family who remain behind in Sri Lanka, who are relying on my money to support the whole family. And when you don't have that idea of progress, you can imagine that after 2 days there, the days feel the same. After 3 days there, you're still not any closer to being out. There's no countdown, there's no calendar you can cross off and say, oh, okay, I'm 360 days to go. Every day feels the same, except worse, because each day you've been a day longer in a place with still no progress, and so by day 100, you still have no concept of when you can leave this camp, and yet you remain there, and you've had 100 days before that, before pressure. And so it was within that atmosphere that we started to see self-harm occur, and we started to see people try and protest and give themselves a voice. There were really simple ways that would have no effect, like filling out complaint forms that were hardly ever read. And then it would, I guess, grow into more violent forms of protest. Things like hunger strikes and thirst strikes. At one point we saw a mass hunger strike over the whole camp, which was about 100 men. And I was away for about 8 days of that. And when I came back, there were men that looked skeletal. And one of those men went on hunger strike for 40 or 50 days. And he was revived when he passed out. And for 2 weeks, the International Health and Medical Services and the Salvation Army case managers said that he needs to be taken to hospital in Australia. But the Department of Immigration didn't want to do that. And they said, he's going to die if you do not do this. And eventually, they agreed, and the man was sent to Brisbane, and he was treated in hospital. And he was told by the Department of Immigration that he'd be put into accommodation in Brisbane. And on the way to the accommodation, he realised they were actually taking him to the airport and they deported him back to Nauru. And so when we talk about the health services in Nauru, I think it cannot be disregarded, the level of, I guess, systemic cruelty which exists in these places and is being legitimised by the fact that this is a deterrence policy, and the whole purpose of these camps is to make it as hard as possible for these people so they do not try and come to Australia by boats. When we talk about international health and medical services, I think, for one, they were underfunded. The resources they had there were more or less people saying all I ever get when I go to IHMS is told to drink water or have Panadol. One of the men joked, he was actually diagnosed with, I can't remember who was diagnosed with, I'm not a doctor. But it's a situation. It was a situational illness. They called it adjustment disorder, because he couldn't adjust to the lifestyle of Nauru Detention Centre. And he said to me, "What is this?" And I said, I explained it to him. He said, "It's okay. They told me I have a knee problem. I drink water. They told me I have a headache. I drink water. I have adjustment disorder. I drink water." One man had a broken collarbone and they gave him Panadol. And it's an interesting thing because for the more serious medical ailments, they'd send him to the Nauru hospital, which actually had less staff and less resources than the facilities within the camp. And so it was an interesting dilemma for me because some of the men I talked to, the doctors who worked for the IHMS, one of them actually said he believes in the policy and he thinks these people deserve to be in a situation like this. And when you have doctors expressing, I guess, a judgment on these people and saying they deserve to not be treated properly, that concerns me greatly. But then on the other side, we had doctors saying there weren't enough resources and that he couldn't prescribe the drugs he wanted to prescribe them. And he couldn't get them the treatment he wanted to treat them. So how can one work in a situation like that? When he said that the majority of the ailments in Nauru are stress-related ailments. So how can you treat stress-related ailments when the whole source of their stress is indefinite detention? It's a very similar thing was said by the torture and trauma counsellors. How can you treat people for trauma and counsel people for trauma when they're constantly being re-traumatised? So even within the camp myself, I saw people slashing their wrists, slashing their necks. I talked to very dear friends of mine who had attempted suicide. And it was actually only 3 weeks after the camp first opened, the first suicide attempts began. And that's when I first began writing. This was in reaction to a very dear friend of mine in the book. He's called Shahab. And his family, he called his family. They told him, they didn't believe him when he said he was in his detention centre because they had no concept of the detention centre, or why shall we be doing this? Because you have to keep in mind, I think a lot of asylum seekers that I met are naive as to what happens when they get to Australia. They have this glorified image of Australia just protecting them, and they can start working straight away and help their families. And so they didn't believe that you guys that he was in the centre, and they decided to leave him. And so he'd come all this way from Iran, gone on this horrible journey, and found himself in this situation. And for many of them, the only thing that keeps them going is hope. That glimmer of hope. And so when his hope was dashed, then he left them really with, I guess in his idea, no other option other than to attempt suicide. And so the first time he attempted suicide, I saw the aftermath of that, and I came in and spoke to the guys that I thought were my friends at this point. And it was at that point that I realised there was a divide, and it became very clear to me that these were asylum seekers and I was a client, or these were prisoners and I was a jailer. Because they accused me of it being my fault that he attempted suicide. At that point, there was nothing I could say or feel that would I guess, disagree with that, because this is our government and our policy, and our camps are camps that we created. This isn't a disaster situation like an earthquake. This is camps that we created, full well knowing what these camps would do to people. There's millions, or not millions, there's lots of studies to suggest that the idea of indefinite detention deteriorates people's mental health. And we've done it before, and we're constantly doing it in Australian detention centres. And so for us to be naive towards this and to suggest that it's an accident, when the whole purpose of this place is a deterrent to guide, creating situational mental illnesses, then there was nothing I could say at that point to disagree with these people. Apparently there was a asylum seeker. And so I came out of there feeling extremely guilty, and that's when I started writing the book. And so, coming back to Australia, I realised that people really had no concept of what I've been seeing and what I've been experiencing. And even when I tried to talk about it, it's a difficult thing to talk about. People say, "How was Nauru?" And I'd say, "Good." Because you can't really begin to explain all of what you've experienced. And it was only through showing my friends my writing that I seemed to get an insight into this dark and mysterious world. Because you look back to what we were told at the start, that no one can talk about these camps to anyone for all time, and the fact that media are banned. And then you take into light what I've just told you about the horrible suicide attempts and riots and self-harm that goes on in these camps, and the views of the doctors, and you realise that if everyone knew about these camps, they'd be as appalled and as horrified as I was, having worked there. And what makes it horrible now is the fact that just after I left, there was a riot that burnt down the camp. And a few asylum seekers set fire to this camp, and there was quite a horrible reaction by the Nauruans, including beating people and abusing people in jail. And it was told to me by my friends who work there, by the asylum seekers, that it was one of the worst times, or the worst time to be in Nauru since the camp first opened. And then a month later, they sent women and children to Nauru. And if you've followed the Children to Detention inquiry, you'll know that the level of abuse that goes on in the camp hasn't stopped since I left, and yet you've got children there. I read a report, well, I actually assisted a friend of mine with one of the reports for the inquiry, and that was about a boy who'd had a hole in his pants, but they wouldn't give him any other pairs of shorts, and so when he went to school, the kids could see his genitalia and everyone laughed at him. And so what I find interesting about this, I guess, debate we have going on at the moment is this idea of justifying this cruelty by saying that it's a humane way to stop people getting on boats, and that we can't let people get on boats. So the way to react to that is to treat them awfully within detention centres. And on one side you have these systemic abuses that arise from the whole point of having a detention centre, but on the other side you have the individual autonomy for evil or cruelty, I don't say evil, but for cruelty that occurs within detention centres. and that detention centres justify. And so now, I think I've talked way too long, but I'm at a point now where I work with asylum seekers in the community, and these people aren't given work rights on bridging visas. And so their situation, albeit a lot better, because they're not in detention, still remains where they're waiting and waiting and waiting, and they have no purpose. They can't get money back to their families. They can't work. They don't have a progression to aim for. And so their lives very quickly become mundane. And you know, the joy of being released from detention for a lot of my guys has fallen away. And now the majority of my men are seeing counsellors to help them deal with the stress and the tension of not knowing what can happen to them. And so, yes, indefinite detention, you know, this program of offshore detention has been horrible. We have 25,000 people in Australia just waiting for a decision on their visa, on their protection visas, and they're not being given it. And so, I think we have a system that's designed to be cruel, and it's instilling in Australians this idea that it's okay to be cruel. I talk to people nowadays, and I hear people saying we have to shoot them. I don't know how one can justify the shooting of these people, but that's the point where we're at today, where it's completely justified to do this as possible.